Hello, and welcome to our Maryland Balance of State Coordinated Entry New User Training. The Coordinated Entry System is nothing without housing. One of our most important functions of the system is to refer people experiencing homelessness to some type of housing rental assistance. So today, we will provide you with an introduction to how HUD housing works. But first, a quick note about what we mean by housing and what we do not mean. Housing, in the context of coordinated entry, means a program that is designed to permanently exit a client from homelessness. This differs from a shelter, which we categorize as an emergency service. Shelter is meant to provide immediate stabilization for people in crisis, a roof over someone's head when they need it the most. A metaphor that I like to use to clarify the difference is that of a net. Imagine, if you will, that you are walking on a tightrope. You don't want to fall, but if you do, you need a net beneath you. But a net is not going to get you back on the tightrope. In this analogy, shelter is like the net, while housing is like the ladder. A net is not going to get you back on the tightrope, but housing, like the ladder, is used to climb back. Where a shelter is there to provide for your basic safety, housing is intended to be a permanent intervention that gets you back on your feet. It might not always be successful 100% of the time. But nonetheless, somebody in housing is no longer homeless, and that is its function. Hopefully this metaphor will help you understand the difference between housing and shelter. A good system will have both shelter and housing. But for today, we will just be talking about housing. There are more varieties of housing than we can possibly get to in this short video. So today we will be focusing on just the types of housing that you are most likely to encounter in your work in the homeless services system. Generally, subsidized housing is divided into two categories: mainstream subsidized housing and homeless dedicated housing. Let's start with mainstream subsidized housing. That includes interventions that subsidize rent and are dedicated to people who are low income in general, rather than people experiencing homelessness in particular. Coordinated entry does not traditionally deal with mainstream subsidized housing, but there can be some overlap in the systems. It is important to know how the mainstream subsidized housing system works, because the homeless dedicated system was designed to mirror it. The two most common types of mainstream housing are public housing, which refers to physical housing units that are owned by the government and rented to low-income households at a rate that is lower than the market. In public housing, the rental assistance is connected to the unit, and when a client moves, the next tenant that moves in benefits from the low cost of housing. The other type of mainstream subsidized housing that you're likely to encounter is the Housing Choice Voucher Program, often called Section 8. This refers to money that the government gives to private landlords to subsidize the rent of low-income tenants. Housing choice vouchers are often attached to the client and will subsidize the client's rent based on their income wherever they decide to live. It is based on a fixed percentage of their income, so as their income increases or decreases, the amount that they will have to pay in rent follows. Both types of mainstream subsidized housing, public housing, and housing choice vouchers have their advantages and disadvantages, but it is important to remember that these models serve as a template for the types of housing that is traditionally available within coordinated entry. Let's talk about that housing now. Coordinated entry housing, unlike mainstream housing, is dedicated for people experiencing homelessness. This is important because unhoused people are a smaller subset of the overall low-income population. By only accepting homeless applicants, there are fewer people overall eligible for these resources, which makes them relatively more plentiful for those that are homeless and need them. So there are two types of rental assistance models and three types of leasing models to talk about. Let's create a little diagram now to explain how they overlap. First, we'll discuss rental assistance models. There are two types: rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. Let's start with rapid rehousing. This is a standard model that is used to help people experiencing homelessness. Here's how it works. A client is offered rental assistance for a specific period of time. This period of time depends on the household's specific needs, but it is often at 6 months initially. For that period of time, the client is brought from homelessness into housing. The client identifies a place to live, and the rental assistance will cover a portion of the client's rent based off their current income. If their income is zero, the rental assistance will pay all of the rent. If their income is higher, the rental assistance will cover a smaller portion. Typically, the program tries to ensure that the client pays no more than 30% of their income towards rent. Then, the client is provided with wraparound services to make that housing sustainable. This can include case management services, enrollment in benefits, job training, and other employment supports. Rapid rehousing providers will also try to connect clients to mental health treatment if needed. It doesn't matter what the client's needs are, the goal of rapid rehousing is to get the client to eventually pay the entire balance of their rent. After the initial rental assistance is set, different programs will do things a little differently. Some will have step-down increments, typically at 3-month intervals, where the client's income is reevaluated and the program assesses whether the client can now afford to pay more of the rent. But remember, the subsidy is only one half of the program model. While the client's rent is being subsidized, their case manager is doing everything in their power to help the client stabilize as quickly as possible by increasing their income, or whatever else they may need. After the initial rental assistance period is over, depending on the program, the client's income and services are reevaluated, just like as they were at the 3-month interval. At this point, the client will likely be reevaluated to see if they need an extension of the rental assistance. Different rapid rehousing grants and programs do this slightly differently, but in general, if a client needs a longer term of rental assistance, their time in rapid rehousing can be extended, often from 6 months to 1 year, and sometimes up to 2 years. The goal of this program is to move the client into market rate housing and provide services so that they can stay there. Eventually, the rental assistance will come to an end and the client will be responsible for his or her own bills. Now, let's talk about permanent supportive housing, or PSH for short. PSH uses the same basic model as rapid rehousing, assistance to pay clients' rents in housing. The only difference with PSH is that the rental assistance is intended to be indefinite. These programs are often designed quite a bit like Section 8 housing, where the client is expected to continue to receive the rental assistance long term, so long as they continue to meet the basic eligibility criteria. As you can imagine, while rapid rehousing clients are intended to move out on their own in a matter of months, PSH clients can stay in their unit for years or even decades. As a result, PSH is quite rare in the system, as it does not have a natural way to cycle clients in and out of it the way that rapid rehousing does. But it also provides an enormous amount of security. Clients in PSH are 99% likely to never become homeless again. So there are 3 things to know about PSH. 1, it is intensive. PSH is designed for clients that are likely never going to be able to afford housing in the private market. 2, it is expensive. Clients will potentially have their rents paid for the rest of their life. As a result, fewer clients per dollar are housed in PSH compared to other program models. Number 3 is that it is rare. Clients in PSH stay there for a long time, and therefore more and more PSH units need to be created as more and more people become homeless. We have just talked about the 2 types of rental assistance available in coordinated entry: permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. Now we will talk about the 3 types of leases that are allowable under these models. It can be helpful to think of them as an X and Y axis of a chart. Different communities have different inventory of these 2 types of subsidies and these 3 types of leases. Your community may mostly have one type, or you can have a more even balance. One way or another, learning the differences will help you understand how to explain housing to your clients. PSH and rapid rehousing programs can have any one of these types of leasing. The first type, and the most common, is called tenant-based. It is similar to the Section 8 model we discussed previously. With tenant-based housing, the program provides rental assistance to the client. Then, the client identifies a private market landlord in the community. The client is often helped by the program to find a landlord, but the key is that the client may choose to take the rental assistance wherever they would like to live, provided that it is 1, habitable, 2, within the fair market rent cap set by HUD for rental assistance, and finally, has a landlord that is willing to rent to them. If the client decides to move, the rental assistance will move with them, wherever they choose to go. The program may not withdraw assistance in a tenant-based leasing model just because the client moves. So long as the client still meets the eligibility criteria, they will continue to have their rent paid. The advantage of tenant-based housing is that clients have the maximum flexibility to choose where they want to live. The freedom to move also grants clients greater autonomy and flexibility. This comes in handy a lot if a client's employment prospects change. The disadvantage is that clients need to work with private landlords that do not have prearranged relationships with housing providers. This can put the client at higher risk of rent increases or similar tenancy problems. Also, it may be very difficult to find a landlord willing to take the client at all. The next type is called project-based. This is the opposite of tenant-based leases and takes more of a public housing approach, while tenant-based takes the Section 8 approach. In project-based housing, the housing program either owns the unit itself or has a longer-term lease with the landlord. The physical unit is then provided for clients. The intention of project-based housing is that the clients can stay as long as they would like, potentially permanently, but if they move, they lose the rental assistance. The advantage of this model is that it may encourage clients to seek to improve their financial situation so that they can afford to live in the private market. Also, by having a prearranged relationship with the landlord, the client is less likely to be rejected for their credit history or rental history, as the property owner is already expecting a formerly homeless client to move in. Also, project-based units are often more affordable and are less likely to impose rent increases on the client compared to tenant-based housing. The disadvantage is that it offers less flexibility and autonomy, forcing the client to live in a particular area that might not be best suited to their needs. It can also be difficult on families who may need to be near their child's school or near an adult's workplace. It can also concentrate poverty in specific areas where programs are able to acquire property at an affordable rate. This puts clients in a position where they may have less social mobility than otherwise. The final type is called sponsor-based, and it attempts to thread the needle between project and tenant-based leasing. Sponsor-based is like tenant-based, where the client moves into a unit with a private market landlord. However, the housing provider acts as a sponsor for the client and will be the one to sign the lease directly with the landlord and then sublet to the tenant. Often the housing program then assumes some responsibility for the rent and damages to the unit. This arrangement can either be prearranged with the landlord, which is a little bit closer to project-based, or created entirely after the client identifies a unit, which is a little closer to tenant-based. The advantage of this model is that a landlord is more likely to agree to lease a unit to a client with low income, perhaps a low credit score, or even criminal history if they know that there is an organization that is taking the ultimate responsibility. It can be amazingly useful as a model for clients that are typically quite difficult to house in tenant-based housing, such as sex offenders or people with multiple evictions. The disadvantage is that this shifts a lot of liability to the program to pay rent even if the client moves out or is unable to. Most grants only provide funding for units with active residents in them, so it can be difficult to find money to pay the promised amount to a landlord if the client is unsuccessful in their housing unit. While coordinated entry will try to refill a unit as quickly as possible, there is still a bit of a risk. It also makes the program liable for damages to the unit, which may be too big of a risk for some smaller housing programs. So those are the three types of leases that can be signed through these programs. These lease types and the two rental assistance types can be mixed and matched when programs are funded by HUD. So you can have rapid rehousing that is either project, tenant, or sponsor-based, and PSH that is either project, tenant, or sponsor-based. Despite the endless variety, you are probably most likely to see rapid rehousing that is tenant-based and permanent supportive housing that is either tenant or project-based. This is not always the case, but if you are going to memorize anything, learn those combinations. The key is figuring out what type of program your client has been referred to and help the client set their expectations accordingly. This has been our discussion on the different types of housing. Today we talked about the difference between permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, as well as the difference between tenant, sponsor, and project-based housing. That's all for today. I'm glad you joined us. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.